Well, good morning, guys. Thanks for spending your morning with us here at Grace. We're excited that you're here. You are stepping into week 3, the third and final week of our series that we're calling Transitions, wading through the muddled middle. And a desire of this series was that we would find hope during those in-between seasons of life. Early on in this series, I noted that I really can't remember a time in my adult life when either me or my wife or my family, we weren't going through some kind of transition. And it seems like that's a common idea from the people that I've talked to over the past few weeks. It seems like most of us at the very least find ourselves in the midst of this muddled middle ground called transition. And during week 1 of this series, we started with Jesus and his disciples during one of the biggest transitions that the disciples had ever been through. A week earlier, they were riding high with all the joy and anticipation of following the next king of Israel. And now they find themselves huddled in a locked room, afraid that the Jewish leaders who had just crucified Jesus would be after them next. Scared and afraid, Jesus appeared in their midst despite the locked doors and the shuttered windows. Right into the middle of this transition, Jesus appeared. And Jesus brought the one thing that they and we need more than we even know in the midst of transition. He brought peace. Peace be with you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. Don't let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. And into the probably what was the darkest day of their lives, Jesus spoke the one thing that they needed more than anything. He spoke peace. And things, they haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years or so. Peace is still that thing that seems to be just beyond the reach of many of us. Instead, it's anxiety, worry, and fear that try to steer our thoughts and our actions. And whether we realize it or not, there's something about the unknown, seemingly dangerous elements in transition that send us running to fear and control, this fear cycle. But into this transition that the disciples were experiencing, and into whatever transition you find yourself in today, Jesus speaks peace. And that was week 1. But into transition, God brings much more than just peace. He also brings promise. God knows our nature to run, to fear, and control. And he also knows how difficult it can be during transition. And so it's in his goodness and grace that he gives us these promises that we can hold fast to in these seasons of flux. 5,467 promises that can serve as anchors for our souls that we can hang on to as we wade through uncertainty and transition. And last week we were introduced to Abram, and he knew a little bit about this idea of being in flux and holding tight to God's promises. In Genesis chapter 12, God, he asked Abram to take some really bold steps to follow him. He says, Abraham, I want you to leave your family, leave the land that you've come to call home, leave everything that you've ever known, everything that's familiar to you, and go to a land that I'm going to tell you about. And what do you know? Abram, he does it. And amazingly enough, he doesn't even bat an eye at the idea. And God, he continues, he says this, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you. So not only do we have this big ask on God's part, but he follows it up with a really big promise. But fast forward just a little bit longer into Abram's life, nothing really seems to have changed. And Abraham, he's beginning to get anxious, and once again, even before Abram can speak, God reassures him with peace and a promise. He says, don't be afraid, Abram. Peace be with you, we could say. I am your shield, your very great reward. And maybe you, like Abram, have begun to lose track of what the true reward is in the midst of these transitions in life. The reward, it isn't just the outcome. It's not the people liking you at the new job or finally having an answer to a long-awaited question. The reward is God. God is the reward. To use Abraham, the reward isn't the being made into a great nation or having the whole world blessed through him. It's not even the having a son bit. God is the reward. And last week we saw how God gave Abram the plan. Trouble was, I don't think it was all that Abram was banking on it to be. You see, before God made Abram's descendants into a great nation, and the whole world was blessed through him and his family, his descendants, they were going to live as slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. And that's the trouble sometimes with the plan, right? I mean, we live in a fallen world where life isn't all rainbows and butterflies. Things are tough, and sometimes the transitions in life that we find ourselves in, they seem like 400 years in captivity. But that doesn't change the plans that God has for our lives, and it doesn't change his promises in the midst of this muddled middle. So not only does God meet us in the transitions of our lives with peace and promise, but we'll see today that he also meets us with provision. So we're going to pick up with Abram's family story, except we're fast forwarding quite a bit. Abram, he's had his name changed by God. Now he's known as Abraham. And not long after that conversation that we left last week in chapter 15 of Genesis, Abraham and his wife, they have a son named Isaac. And Isaac, he eventually has a son named Jacob. And Jacob, he has a son named Joseph. And a really long story short, Joseph ends up being in charge of the whole of Egypt while they navigate a particularly difficult famine in that land. And before long, the rest of his family joins them in Egypt. And before long, a lot of the major players in the story, they die. And then the new leaders of Egypt, they begin to forget all that Joseph and his family had done for the country. And it got to the point where the Israelites, as they had come to be called, were now slaves to the Egyptian people, just like God had told Abram way back in chapter 15 of Genesis. And we're going to pick up the story in Exodus chapter 13. And a lot has transpired in the first 13 chapters of Genesis, but to suffice it to say that God has shown his power and he has taken his people out of slavery, and they're now beginning their journey that eventually would lead to the promised land. And this is Exodus chapter 13, starting in verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them down the road through the Philistine country, though that way was shorter. For God said they'll face war, and they might change their minds and return back to Egypt. No sooner are the Israelites a little ways into this transition out of Egypt and into this great future that God had said that they will experience, they are met with this stark reality that I think we face way too often when we find ourselves in transition. There's this short way, there's this short, direct way from Egypt to this land that God has promised, and there's the longer, more winding, arduous way. The straight, direct route, we're looking at like 2 to maybe 3 weeks. But instead, they take this meandering journey that ended up lasting 40 years. I mean, talk about a detour, right? And this is one of the hardest things about transition sometimes, because we say, God, what's wrong with the short route? What was wrong with the like short A to B thing? It's straight. I go from one point to the other. I can't get lost. It's straight. Let's do that one, God. To which he points back to us and he directs us to this promise that we find in Scripture that we may not like a whole lot, especially when we find ourselves in these transition moments of life. It's in Isaiah chapter 55. And it says this, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. And as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." God, he's thinking and acting on a whole different plane of understanding from where we see things. And while we just see a straight path from where we are to where we want to be, he says, no, if they go that way, they'll end up discouraged and they'll end up right back where they started. They need the long way. The journey is important. And the same thing happens to us. We wonder why this transition is taking so long. But the God who knows the end from the beginning and all the transitions along the way, he says, I know you're not digging the length of this process, but believe me, this is for your good. It's for my glory. And it was probably long, hard transitions like this that led the Apostle Paul to writing Romans 8:28, another promise that I love to hang on to in the midst of transitions. It says this, for we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So in the long journey, God works. And in the short journey, God works. And in that transition that isn't going quite right, and in the one that couldn't be going any smoother, God works. So like the Israelites here in Exodus 13, we need to lean into God and trust the process. In verse 21, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. And I love this part because it just shows a real tangible provision for his people. Guys, do you need to know which direction to go? Just look up. You're going to see a cloud. You're going to see a pillar of fire. I'm right here as you're journeying. But he also, it's like really tangible provision as well in another way, because if you've ever been to a desert, you know how hot the temperatures can get during the day. We're talking like 90s, hundreds during the day, but also you flip it to the nighttime and it can be even below freezing in some cases. Downright unbearable. But as God calls the Israelites out, he said, I'm going with you. In fact, I'll always be right in front of you. Just look up and you'll see me. During the day, I'm going to be a cloud to shield you from this blazing sun. And at night, I'll be a pillar of fire to provide light and warmth as you journey on. Want to travel by night? No worries. I'll keep the light on for you. And then check this out, because his provision, it has a word for us that goes beyond a little bit of shade or a little bit of light in the darkness. God Almighty is with these guys. He will always be with them, right in front of them, leading the way as they transition from slaves to a great nation. The same is true for us. And last week we briefly referenced this verse in Deuteronomy 31:8. It says this, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. And that's like a go-to, hang on to type verse as we find ourselves in these in-between seasons of life. When we're in this awkward spot between where things have always been and maybe where we haven't quite arrived to that finish line yet. It's a promise that you can grab tight to. I mean, do you feel like you're on this long, slow journey? Well, take heart. Peace be with you. There's a promise for you in Deuteronomy 31. It's a promise of provision right where you need it most. And so the Israelites, they're traveling with God down this long journey, this long road to the promised land. But there's another rather major obstacle that gets introduced into this transition. Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, he's had a heart change, and he no longer wants to watch his entire labor force walk out on him. So he heads out after the Israelites with the full force of his army in tow. Exodus 14, starting in verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. And they were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? Why would you have done this to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. I mean, there's that tone again, guys. I mean, do you remember it from last week with Abram? These guys, these Israelites, they are terrified. They're facing a situation that they see as insurmountable. There's an inevitable outcome here, God. We're going to die. God, you said you were going to take us up out of this situation, and look at us now. We'd have been better off if we never started this journey in the first place. I mean, have you ever had this conversation with God? I told you this was going to go poorly, God, and look what happened. It's exactly like I told you it was going to turn out. Thankfully, Moses and the Israelite leaders, he had his eyes set, his gaze set a little higher than this situation that's swirling around. And he says, don't be afraid. Answers the people and he says this, stand firm and you will see the deliverance, or we could say you will see the provision that the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see right now, today, these Egyptians you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to do in the midst of this muddled middle ground of transition. It's just to be still and trust that God is able to act on our behalf. All we can think about is this horrible outcome that we're just all but certain it's going to happen. We've left Egypt, and now Pharaoh is here, and we're going to die. What have you done to us? I told you we should have stayed put. God, he just broke up with me, and now I'm going to be single forever, living in my parents' basement. And I'm thinking, God, he's looking down from the throne of heaven in complete control of everything, and he's saying, you know, I think there's a few more options available than that. But there's something about these transitions that can bring out the biggest naysayers inside of all of us. I mean, I'm single now. This must mean, it has to mean that nothing's ever going to change and I'm going to be with my parents forever. I'll never find someone, God. And God's like, whoa. Pump the brakes there, chief. It'll be okay. Calm down. I might just have a few other options besides those, but thanks for trying to help. Why don't you just take a chill pill and let me do my thing? And that's exactly what God does here for these Israelites, because over the next 16 verses, God, he does the unimaginable. He brings 2 to 3 million Israelites across a sea on dry ground, and the entire army that was following them was swept away in that same sea. Now tell me, which of those Israelites saw that coming? I'm guessing no one. I mean, absolutely no one. But God is saying, I told you I was going to take care of this. I told you I had you in the palm of my hand. I wasn't going to lead you this far and then have everything blow up in your face. I'm Jehovah Jireh, God who provides. I've done it over and over again. Did you think I couldn't help you overcome this little obstacle and bring you through to the other side? Coming up on 2 years ago now, Jess and I, we began this process of selling our home. Week 1 of this series, I briefly mentioned that if you were to ask us at that time, we probably would have said that we were going to grow old in the house. But over the course of that summer, God changed those plans pretty substantially. And as we started down that transition, we watched as time and time again, God provided at just the right time, just what we needed. And finally, we were about to put our house on the market when we thought we were getting kind of this basic plumbing service call, and it turned into a nightmare. Before long, we were told that we were facing up to a $25,000 bill for a new septic system, and our heads were reeling. At first, we were hesitant to move, but God had done so much, and we were certain that he was leading this way. But now we're left thinking, did we hear that wrong? What happened? And that night, we were having dinner with our neighbors to tell them that we were thinking of moving and just to hang out. We didn't want them to just kind of see the sign go up in the front yard. We wanted to be able to tell them in person. And as we were talking, we said, well, don't say goodbye quite yet, because this isn't a done deal. We just got this estimate, and unless God does something miraculous to bring this price down, we'll still be here because we don't have $25,000 for this repair and the move. It's just not going to happen. And a little bit later, we left to go home because the kids needed to get ready for bed. And while we were getting ready for bed, Jess got a phone call, and we didn't pick it up in the midst of all of that, but we get a voicemail, and it says, give us a call back when you and Ryan are together so we can chat. And so we get the kids down, and we give them a call back. And it turns out they had heard about our septic situation, and they said they wanted to pay for the cost of the repairs for us. And guys, to this day, I don't know what was wrong with our septic system or what it cost to repair it. But I do know that just like the Israelites, God provided for us right when things looked hopeless and impossible. Jehovah Jireh is his name, and he's still in the business of making a way where there seems to be no way. And guys, that wasn't the only way that we watched God provide in the midst of our transition from one home to another, again and again, just like with the Israelites. Because not too much longer into this journey in the desert, they found themselves without water. And guess what? God does another miracle. He changes the bitter water at Marah to the best water around. And later on, they're beginning to grumble and complain that they want something to eat. And God, in his great love and mercy, he literally has it rain down bread from heaven. It was called manna, and it sounds like it was incredible. From what I've been reading, it sounds like this stuff could have tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like. At one point, it's described like a honey wafer, and at another point, it's like it was made with olive oil. And another time, it says it tastes like coriander. It sounds like a pretty amazing deal, but just as quick as they were all about the manna, the Israelites are like, I want meat. I want something different. It's kind of like what I do with Jess every now and then. It's like, Jess, can we please not have chicken for the 4th day in a row? I'm tired of this. And God, he hears the Israelites cry for meat. And suffice it to say that they get a whole lot more than they bargained for with this meat demand that they place on God. But God, he provides in a way that honestly, it still has me a little stunned reading it today. I mean, don't forget that there are tons of people in this caravan. Moses says there's 600,000 men, not to mention the women and the children that are a part of this deal. But at one point, Moses, he even wonders out loud if God can really provide enough meat for so many people. And if you ever wondered a similar question, the answer is, well, yes, he can. In fact, he brings so many quail, these little birds, into the Israelite campsite that they're stacked 3 feet deep. A day's walk that way, a day's walk that way, and that way, and that way, in every direction, a day's walk in every direction. So the people, they're gathering up quail, and it says that each person gathered no less than 60 bushels. I mean, we're talking some top shelf type provision right here. This might have been where Paul got some inspiration as he was writing Ephesians 3:20. He's wrapping up this encouragement to the Ephesian people, and he says, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask for or imagine. And I love this word immeasurably when it comes to these quails, because I don't think there was anybody counting these quails. And I don't think anybody in their mind thought, oh, this is what we need to have happen. I'm thinking they were just thinking, oh, well, we just want to have like a nice meat dinner here. But I refuse to believe that anyone in that camp was thinking, I want 60 bushels of quail. Water, manna, quail. But there was even more yet that he provided. Because, guys, it's really easy to find ourselves amazed at God's overtly miraculous provisions of things like these. But he was doing much more than that. The sandals and the clothes that they wore for this 40-year journey, they didn't wear out. In fact, they were just as good the day that they walked into the promised land as the day they left Egypt 40 years earlier. I mean, talk about coming through in almost every way imaginable. It's important not to get lost in all of these big demonstrations of God's provision and yet miss out on the more subtle things along the way. Sandals and clothes lasting 40 years. I don't think anyone during this journey was praising God for that type of provision. But that's just like God to lead them on this long path out of Israel instead of this short path. And yet show this great provision to them all along the way. So it's important to celebrate the big, huge, miraculous type displays of God's provision, but we need to be mindful to celebrate and be thankful for the little, easily unnoticed displays of provision. Many times, it ends up looking like things that didn't quite go the way we thought they should. Times where the plan didn't play out quite the way we expected. And you know what? We ended up being all the better as a result of it. The most remarkable part of God's provision for us is simply how all-encompassing it is. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that his most extravagant display of provision for us, it started after Adam's fall in the Garden of Eden. And there were a couple of transitions along the way where things didn't quite seem to be working out as well or smoothly as we all would have thought. But God says, don't worry, there's still a plan, it's still on schedule. And eventually this plan, it led to our provision through Jesus, the Son of God, coming to earth in human flesh. 100% God and yet 100% man. And Jesus, he did what we couldn't. He lived a perfect life. But on the cross, he had the sins of humanity placed on him. He died in our place, bearing the full weight of all our sin. And in that moment, even his disciples thought this transition would lead to the end, but God said, hold tight. I'm just getting started. These plans are not done yet. They're still going strong, because after 3 days, he arose from the grave, displaying his power over sin and death. And because of Jesus, we can experience the same kind of victory. We can now walk in renewed, right relationship with the Father. I mean, talk about provision. As we begin to wrap up this transitions series, my hope is that you've found a new perspective of the transitions that you find yourself in life. Whether you're navigating life with a new boss, or you're learning what it means to look like to be the boss. If you're facing a new relationship status, or if you're learning to navigate life after loss, my hope is that your perspective now recognizes Jesus in the midst of all those seasons. Just like the disciples in that locked room, or the Israelites that wandered around the desert, Jesus is with us in our transitions, and he's bringing us peace and promise and provision. And he's using all of that to write a beautiful story, beginning to ending and all the in-betweens. And he's molding and shaping us from one degree of glory to another. And it's not done yet. He's still orchestrating and custom making all of these transitions that we experience for our good. Even when we don't feel like that's the way it's turning out. He works all things together for good. All things together for good. Just like he said he was going to. And so if things are going great and your transitions are going just the way you hoped, know that he is with you and he is good. And if things really suck right now and the transitions you're facing feel like they couldn't get any worse, know that he's still with you. And know that he's still good. He wants nothing more than to calm you with his peace that he speaks over you, and remind you of his promise that he is rejoicing over you with gladness, and to show you in time just how he's using this very transition to provide for you in the very best way possible. Because he writes a beautiful story, and your story is not done yet.